Chapter 7, the Presidency. Previous chapter on Congress, the Constitution, it enumerates the powers of Congress and says Congress shall have these powers. So it's like that's the powers you have. But they do have the elastic clause, and the elastic clause says all powers necessary and proper to carry out the other powers. And it's called the elastic clause because that stretches the power of Congress, and thus the power of Congress thus has expanded under that. But the presidency, and we'll get into this in the next chapter on the executive branch, the powers of the presidency is not really defined. The big thing that the president's in charge of is foreign affairs, because you cannot have 535 people deciding foreign affairs. That would be a disaster. And so while Congress ultimately declares war, the president's the one that would originally commit troops, because you need a single individual. And when they were drafting the Constitution, there was actually a discussion of having like a committee, an executive committee or something like that. And that idea was kind of thrown out because it's like, no, you need a single person in charge. Because if the country faces a crisis, then you have to have a single person in charge, or you're just going to have a bunch of infighting. And so that's where we come up with the concept of the President of the United States. Some of the things we're going to learn about in this chapter, first of all, the qualifications. There's not really any qualifications. There is, you have to be a natural born citizen, which there's some debate about that, because John McCain, when he was running for president, of course he was in 2008, he was a true war hero in the Vietnam War. He's a prisoner of war for 5 years. But he was a child of they had a long military family with a long history of great service in the military. So he was born actually in the Panama Canal Zone. And there were some people like, well, he wasn't a natural born citizen. But most were like, no, it's fine. So natural born citizen, and have to be 35 years of age. But beyond that, there's not much qualifications. You don't have to have a degree or anything like that. And in fact, it says the resident of the United States for 14 years or longer is what it says too. Washington had established the two-term tradition, but then a guy named Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s, he was elected 4 times. And after that, they passed the 22nd Amendment, and that limited the president to 2 terms by law. So now they could actually serve a little more than 2 terms, because if they were vice president, someone died in office, they could fill that term out and then still run 2 more times. So conceivably, I think they could serve as much as 10 years, but it's effectively, for the most part, 8 years. And then they talk about within that too is the Presidential Succession Act, which lays out, and that was the 25th Amendment was passed because after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson, and you see the bumper sticker behind me, Kennedy was president, Johnson was his vice president. Lyndon Johnson was there with him. And what if they had both been killed? Who would be president? It wasn't really spelled out. So they spell that out, but they also spell out presidential disability, because Woodrow Wilson, he had a stroke and was pretty much incapacitated, and his wife kind of ran things. And they're like, what if the president is completely incapacitated? What if they go crazy? After the January 6th insurrection, there was talk within the White House about invoking the 25th Amendment with regards to President Trump because of his actions before and after January 6th. And so you hear it for that from time to time. So foreign affairs is a big part of what the president does. The president has a cabinet. Go to whitehouse.gov, you'll see the president's cabinet. It used to be Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, back then, Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary of State, and the Attorney General, who is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer. Those are the 4 cabinet members. Today, there's like 20 cabinet members because the role of government has greatly expanded because of the Industrial Revolution. And so we've got a Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Education, and on and so forth. The most recent one being the Secretary of Homeland Security. That was created after 9/11 to coordinate law enforcement efforts to prevent terrorist attacks, both foreign and domestic. The president can work out executive agreements and can work out treaties, but treaties have to be ratified by Congress, and so that's much more difficult to do. So more recently, a lot of presidents go to executive agreements. The problem with executive agreements, and this relates to your homework assignment, is that they can be overdone. So President Obama had worked out an executive agreement, the Paris Climate Accords, to try to combat climate change. Congress wasn't going to approve that because you have to have 2/3, and you might have got 50%, but you're not going to get 2/3. And so it's real difficult to ratify a treaty. So he just made an executive agreement. But the problem with an executive agreement is the next president can come and undo the executive agreement, which is exactly what Trump did with the Paris Climate Accords. And then the next president can come and undo that president's undoing of the previous presidents, which is what Biden did. And it is a mess. And then that leaves other countries in the world spinning their head and like, what is going on over there? Who knows what the next policy is going to be? And that's true too for executive orders. So if the Congress doesn't do what the president's hoping they would do, they can issue executive orders, but they better be careful that it's not a law. And what's the difference between an executive order and a law? Well, an example of this, again, a law related to Trump couldn't get the funds for his wall that he wanted. Congress didn't pass it. And they're like, no, we're not going to give you money. Congress controls the money, not the president. The president's job is to enforce the law, not to make the law. And so Trump said, I'll take money from the military and use it to build my wall. And Congress was like, no, you can't do that. That money's for the military. And Trump says, oh, yes, I can. My job's to enforce the law. We have a crisis at the border, and I need to secure the country, and I can use that money for the military to secure it by building this wall. And they argue about it, and guess what happens? It goes to the courts to try to decide who is right. And I think in that case, they actually sided with Trump. Of course, Commander-in-Chief is one of the main responsibilities for the president as Commander-in-Chief, and there discusses that as well. And then a lot of this chapter is about how presidents lead, different leadership styles. The presidency has become, of course, a lot more powerful since Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. It's continued to expand that power as we've continued to go forward. Today, the president has a lot to do with putting forth a budget, and then Congress works with the president to hash out an agreement on that, and just a lot of information about things like that. The presidency is the bully pulpit. They can help steer the country with different policies and things that they feel is important. Most recently with Biden, a lot of that's been climate change and green energy and things like that. And he did get passed what was called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it really was a climate change bill. And previously, of course, Trump used the bully pulpit with regards to immigration policy and things like that. But the president's limited too in how much they can do. We don't have a dictator, thank goodness, and hopefully we never will. And so the president's power is limited and should be limited. But they definitely can try to dictate things for sure. So that's the gist of it. Enjoy the chapter on the presidency.